to Wild and Weird Radio, a Wild and Weird West Virginia podcast. Welcome to Wild and Weird Radio, a Wild and Weird West Virginia podcast. Tonight we are joined by the master of spooktacularness himself, Gene St. Jean. We're going to talk a little bit about some other stuff that he's doing, but mostly tonight we're going to be covering the topic of vampirism. Vampires, strigoi, whatever you want to call them. We're going to be hitting a lot of all that. It's going to be a good time. So how's everybody doing tonight?
I'm doing good. Good. How about you, Gene? You got a bunch of bats back there behind you?
Yeah, I'm doing good. Just always kind of perpetually trying to get caught up on stuff, work stuff.
Yeah. Know that feeling.
Yeah. 100% can relate to that. That is just
that feeling.
Especially when you're in the industry that you're in, it is never ending.
Yeah, which is a good thing.
Yeah, it is. It is because we're dealing with it on a smaller scale than what you're dealing with, but still keeping up with the wholesale stuff is insane. Having to keep making molds and churn out new pieces and putting them together and then putting them on cards and sending them out. It's just
You guys grind out a lot of stuff too. You guys make a lot of product.
Yeah, we do. It's a pretty broad net. But that's kind of what has kept us busy is because it's such a broad net. We're not just appealing to the Bigfoot community. We got some stuff going with the UFO people and with Mothman and other cryptids and stuff like that. So it's been great. If I'd like to have seen where we'd be if last year wasn't the way it was, but we're hoping that 2022 is going to be everything that we had hoped 2020 was going to be.
Yeah, hopefully the bounce back will be good. I mean, obviously there's issues, but I found like over the dead zone of the last year and a half, the things that took off for me is my statue stuff. I don't produce anywhere near what you guys do in terms of the breadth of your product line. I have I don't know, whatever the statues I've done so far, 5 statues maybe, and then a couple of other odd and ends on my store. And the only things that sell are the expensive things, the statues, like the little bust. I don't have any busts, but like the plaque stuff and the other kind of odds and ends sells very little. But the statues, especially Patty and Mothman, I grind out those things every week.
Oh, no doubt.
And
it's because they're amazing. That's
they're
why.
Awesome, dude. Yeah. We are definitely getting us a Mothman soon. There's no question. It's been too long.
Yeah, we were talking about that. We've put off ordering one way too long, and we're actually going to put in an order for at least 4 items from you here soon.
Oh, cool. Yeah, I have a new thing that I've started on. I want to put up there in the next week or so, but I haven't shown it yet. But so before you order anything,
okay, we'll hold off.
Okay,
I got you. Copy. Understood.
Cool. But,
enough said.
Yeah,
we understand.
I bet in the midst of all the other stuff, I'm coming to the tail end of all the stuff I'm working on for our creature replica alien line. Fine.
Oh, sweet.
And there's a ton of stuff with that, and then just my regular workload of stuff, and then a few new things. Like I've still never put the Bell Witch and the Minnesota Iceman up in my store. I did maybe a dozen and a half Icemen for
the Minnesota conference.
For Abe, and then I made a few for the Cryptozoology Museum. Lauren picked them up, and but I just never got around to actually getting it together. Like I figured if I'm going to put them up, let me just get a bunch cast. I'll put them on the side, and then they'll be at least the parts are ready, and I can start putting them together. Right. And I did the same thing with the Bell Witch, but I never got around to finishing the the cover art for the Bell Witch for the variation that I'm going to sell. Because usually I do something different with the one that goes through the STM Kickstart. And then I change the artwork a little too, you know, and just, you know, getting that done. And now I'm finishing the new Kickstarter thing, the Flatwoods Monster for them.
Yes.
Speaking of which, that is probably the most beautiful Flatwoods Monster sculpt that I've seen.
Thanks.
And I love the shape of it because it's got this really awesome kind of flowy feel, but it's also that rigid, like there's organic something behind it. It's like this awesome mix of ethereal and also having that structure underneath is really cool looking, man.
Yeah, I wanted to, when I sketched the original picture out, what I started to come across as I was noodling around on it is to get kind of a feel for like almost like a C3PO-ish kind of vibe to it. And and keep the lines really simple. And that's where I'm finishing it now, and it's getting, there's a little more detail than what you already saw and what's in the drawing, because I kind of can't help myself. It's what I do. But I wanted to keep that clean sort of 50s monsters a little.
Yes.
But some of the line work and angles is almost has like an elvish type.
It does. It
kind of work too. You know what I mean?
It had that elvish kind of feel to it, like looking at just the angles and the body shape and the posture of the arms and stuff. It was just really, really cool. I can't wait to actually see it fleshed out and finished. It's going to be killer.
Yeah, some had up this week too, and I tried to keep it relatively simple for molding. Luckily, it's not something that, like the Witch, I went off the rails, and it's just putting that together is just a giant pain in the butt. You know, it's
a lot of animation in that, though.
Yeah, it was worth the trouble, but it's just a giant pain in the ass when I have to cast all those pieces and assemble it, and then make sure that I pack things really carefully. But there's a lot of delicate aspects. It's another reason why I didn't get any complaints from when I shipped, I don't know, 50 or something to Seth. You know, I heard one guy had something break on it, but nothing came back to me. And I mean, when all the stuff I've sold through my store, you know, what's ironic is the only problems I've had with breakage is when I've dealt with wholesalers. And I think it's because they stick it on a shelf in the back and then they get jumbled around.
Or they put too much weight on it.
Yeah, and because I've got 2 breakage pieces back, and the boxes were trashed, so I know they were mishandled. But I'm eliminating all the wholesale stuff that I was doing, because the other problem I ran into, which you guys probably saw, is as soon as I started advertising on Facebook, buying advertising with them.
Oh, I saw that.
Yeah, 2 or 3 bootleggers just stole my photos
instantly.
Not even selling anything. And then one guy sent me a picture of what someone had sent him that they received when they ordered it. And I guess they had just had somebody copy what I did, like pick like the worst sculptor you could think of, have them try to copy it. And then they molded it all as one piece, and it looked awful, man. It was like 2/3 of the side, and looked like somebody left it next to an oven and it half melted.
Oh, wow.
You know, so I was really pissed when I started seeing that stuff go up.
No doubt.
And I chased them down online. I think I might have gotten them pulled out of the Google search, and I sent them a copyright thing. And
good.
Then I went after Facebook a couple of times, who don't care.
They don't care.
No, they don't.
No, Bob, they don't care at all.
Facebook has actually started coming. What's really funny is Facebook and Instagram has started coming after us for posting our own material now.
You know what they tried to? Initially they pulled my Patty statue because they said it was pornographic. So I was like, "What am I gonna have to put some like dots over the tits or something?"
What?
Oh man!
And then
world.
I appealed the ruling on it because I've been showing this stuff for like however long, you know.
Yeah.
So then almost immediately turned it around because they wouldn't let me put it in the store, and I was like, you know, this is a Bigfoot, you know. It's where do you,
that is crazy. That is such an odd reason to pull it.
I literally get like verbatim porn in my Facebook feed in lieu of anime type stuff.
Right.
and like, advertisements for like AliExpress selling like all sorts of sexual aids and things.
Yeah.
It's like,
Yeah, absolutely.
But don't you look
Like,
at a patty. Don't you do that.
yeah. But
don't you
yeah,
look at
You
those
don't you
voluptuous
don't you
hairy
do that.
tatas.
I
yeah,
mean,
they changed it almost immediately. But yeah, so I
wow,
mean,
dude.
but at any rate, the reason I went into that rambling diatribe is like through the pandemic, I guess because people are sitting home just buying stuff off of Amazon, the internet,
Oh yeah.
all the statue stuff took off
Yeah.
and like became
That's
kind
awesome.
of a minor income stream. Whereas before, I had a dude working for me doing casting, and as long as I made a little bit here and there that I could contribute to paying his salary, it was cool. It's like, 'cause I'd do the things for Seth, and then I'd put them up online because I already had them. And I own the
Right.
copyright the statues, so figured I'd do something with them. But then, like, when he stopped coming in when the pandemic hit, all of a sudden the stuff sort of started rolling, and now just like that handful of statues, like they do pretty well every month. So
It's awesome.
just going to get away from the, like I said, the wholesale thing. People want a big break, or they want a certain percentage off, or they want me to drop ship.
Yep.
And I have nothing but problems with the people I wholesale with. So I was like, why bother? I can sell them myself. And then if there's a headache, like the only real problems I had, one guy got a patty, and somehow the post office managed to snap her shins, which are like 3/4 of an inch thick. It didn't even, I remolded her with the feet separate because the mold was tearing where the feet were coming out.
Yeah.
They somehow, because the guy contacted me, he's like, yeah, I got it. It looks great, but it's broken. I just want to return it and get a refund. I was like, hold on, dude. I'll just send you another one. Send me back the broken one. I'll get my money back from the post office. So I replaced it. That was the only problem I ever had. Not to jinx myself, but so
Well, we had a Bigfoot. You saw the big 11-inch Bigfoot statue that we made.
Was that one you had? You showed when we did the fact or fiction thing.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah,
that one.
Right. Yeah.
I had one of those that we shipped to Washington last year. It's for a kid's birthday. It arrives on the birthday day. Somehow USPS managed to break it through the torso. That's like an inch and a half thick, solid resin. These weren't like, slush cast or nothing. These are solid. And somehow they snapped it in the middle. And so it's the same thing. We got the money back from the post office. I sent them a new one.
Mm-hmm.
And they sent me the old broken one. I actually repaired the broken one, got it straightened up, put some metal pins up in there and glued it all in, got it all situated. And then we wound up selling it like half off to somebody.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, it was just, it blew my mind that they snapped it in half.
Yeah. That's the thing. I mean, you got to pack the stuff really good, and that's all you can really do. And then if you just create kind of a reputation with the people that buy your stuff. I mean, we've had issues with this stuff. Our creature replica stuff too. And when people have a problem, you just take care of the problem and just leave them happy.
Yeah.
Help them out.
Yep. Yeah. That's the best thing you can do, man.
Yeah. You can't stress out over it, But
well, we're 100% on board behind you guys whenever you're launching any of your new stuff from you individually, or whenever you drop the alien stuff.
Well, look, you can actually show it now. So
yeah, because we do the video feed now, and we're up on YouTube, so we can have you on when y'all guys are ready, and you can actually do a video showcase with everything.
I'll even make you a banner. We'll put you a banner back there. No.
Yeah,
we'll do it big. We'll do it right. We'll do a major launch.
Yeah.
Nice.
So yeah, we'll talk about some of that more later. Let's go ahead and dive into the meat of tonight.
Wait a second. I do want to touch something, Joe. We got some feedback last time.
We did. That's right. You're right. We did get some feedback from last week's episode. And so go ahead.
You remember the question I asked, right?
Yeah.
The major question, was Wednesday very weird? We got 2 people who said, yeah, it was. Like,
yeah,
it wasn't just us. So that's you, that's me, that's Jess, and that's 2 other people who spoke up on here and said, yeah, they had a very weird day on that Wednesday. It was the 6th, right?
Yeah, it was the 6th.
Yeah, it was the 6th. Very strange day. So thank you guys for chiming in and letting us know that it wasn't just all in our minds or some kind of, weird synchronicity, I guess. I don't know. I don't know what it was, but I thought that was notable, and I thought it was very interesting that they actually confirmed that they also had a weird day.
Yeah. Well, guys,
Let's
just
get to
like
it.
last week, if there's anything that you guys want to chime in on, we've got the YouTube feed now that you can actually communicate directly with us right alongside the video, and we respond back. So keep that up, guys. We
Yep.
really appreciate it. So vampires.
Vampires. Oh,
We've
wait.
been we've been sitting on this episode with Gene for a while,
To get
and
a vampire killing kid on here. Hang on. Got me somewhere around here. I have a steak.
he is
I don't know what's that.
he is our go-to source for most things horror, and especially like old monsters, monster lore, because the guy's just a tremendous wealth of knowledge when it comes to this stuff. And so we're gonna just kind of let Gene go with this, and we're gonna ask questions along the way and give some input here and there. But this is gonna be a very interesting addition to our Spooktacular for 2022, and so I hope you guys enjoy it. So, Gene, the floor is yours, my friend. Let's get into some vampires.
Well, I think I don't know where you guys kind of started with this kind of stuff, but I got into it pretty young, so obviously my first introduction to this topic was Dracula, and I remember
Same here.
Probably the first thing was the movie, the Bella movie, obviously. And then I remember in third or fourth grade, we always had these book fairs at the school where you'd go through, you'd have a little catalog, you could pick out which books you wanted to order, and like a month or two later, you'd get them, and they'd hand them out in school. And I bought an edition of Dracula from that was it was almost like the size of a graphic novel, and it had interspersed illustrations, but it was the actual regular prose book. And so immediately, really early on, I was really familiar with the novel as opposed to the movie, which was pretty cut down. Obviously the Bella one was like a refilming kind of the version that they did as a stage play. So, and later as I got more into the vampire thing, I found that Stoker's version of vampires was kind of a combination of Eastern vampire and witch and also werewolf lore, sort of amalgamated into this creature to make it an even more imposing creature, almost indefeatable, with the powers to transmute and everything into different elements and to different creatures that were sort of avatars of his evil as kind of represented in those times, by like wolves and bats and things like that. Obviously today it's not something we can relate to as easily because wolves are like a revered, protected species, and bats have even become the same thing, although their reputation's kind of taken a hit since the whole COVID thing.
Yeah.
And, so we kind of start there mostly with what most people know vampire lore is kind of Eurocentric. Stuff comes out of like Eastern Europe, Baltic states, and things like that. And we start with kind of Dracula, and then probably around the same age, I became aware that Dracula was an actual historical figure. And he's obviously surrounded with as much folklore as he is history. So it's not really, it's hard to pick apart of all the stuff I've read. It's really hard for anyone to pick apart how much is actually real when they talk about him, obviously staking his enemies and the type of brutal tactics he used, which in those days was typical, things like crucifixions and staking and all those things. That's the way people fought, and
that was the end game. Normally you would do something like that as kind of like the exclamation point on the back end of something to say, hey, look, if you come around here, if you mess around, this is what's going to happen.
Right. He had a smaller force in a smaller country, and he would destroy the morale of the troops that would come into his kingdom to try to take it over, you know, and he lost a bunch of times too. He ended up being traded as a prisoner as a kid while his father was still in power, and his brother was also traded. So there's a lot there that's interesting, and later in life he became so like so idolized. Like I had a friend of mine who basically said that he was kind of like the George Washington of, you know, would that be Romania, I guess?
Yeah,
Romania.
Romania.
Yeah. And people there don't like the fact that he's, I guess, unless you're involved in the tourist industry, don't like the fact that his name's sort of sullied by turning everything he did for the, you know, for the benefit of his countrymen into sort of this like personification of evil and Satanism. But once you leave Europe, a lot of that stuff followed the Europeans into this country. And you can, I think, was it like maybe 10, 15 years ago, they started finding these graves in around Connecticut where they found burials that were marked by just odd desecrations. And after doing some research, they found that there was like epidemics of like tuberculosis, things like that, and which they called consumption at the time. And what would happen is this disease would sweep through a family, and sometimes it would, you know, and through towns. It wouldn't even necessarily be like it wiped out a family really quick. It could be over a number of years, but a family would be stigmatized to the point where after you have 3 or 4 people die in your family, the townspeople go and start digging up the corpses and find, you know, maybe the latest person that died was still very kind of bloated, which is just, you know, new corpses blowed up with all the gases. You might see some leakage of blood around the nose and mouth. And and apparently like your fingernails seem to grow a little bit, but also your cuticles recede and your gums recede and the hair appears to grow. And it looked to them like this person was still in the grave and was maybe escaping and, you know, killing off the rest of their relatives. So it wasn't, even though at the time there was actually scientific data on tuberculosis, pretty early data, and it wasn't like they could actually do anything about it. But that kind of knowledge didn't really disseminate into smaller towns and things, so that they were still stuck in this, in the grip of folklore and mythology and all these kind of ancient beliefs from the motherlands, you know? So they started, but yeah, so a while back, they started to find these oddly desecrated graves. And apparently one of the first ones was up in Connecticut. And these kids were playing in an old kind of like mine area where there's a lot of like a gravel mine or something. And a kid found a skull. So, you know, takes it back to his parents. I don't know if I would have done that as a kid. I probably would have kept it. And what the police thought at first, there was this famous serial killer in like was it like the 90s or early 2000s? I can't remember the guy's name now. He was basically kidnapping women and strangling them. So they thought maybe this dude was burying victims there. But the skull was so old and brown, they realized it was, you know, maybe a couple 100 years old, something like that. And they found a few graves where the heads had been cut off and the bones had been all mixed around, and like the thigh bones crossed across the chest. Sometimes the skeleton was pulverized, looked like they were probably rooting around to find the heart, because they would do things like if they suspected people who were sick with, you know, vampirism, they would bury them like face down in the ground. So if they tried to dig their way out, they would just be digging down. You know, to behead them, they'd burn the heart. In one case of this girl named Mercy Brown, where basically almost her whole family was wiped out by tuberculosis. And after I think 3 or 4 of the family members died and the brother was sick, they dug up one of the sisters, and she looked pretty fresh in the grave. I guess she had been buried. They had a very cold winter, and she was still freshly more or less, maybe a season in the grave. So she looked pretty good in there. They took out her heart and burned it and fed it to the brother, thinking that could break the curses by destroying the heart of the vampire. And he ended up dying, I think, a few months later anyway. Maybe from eating the ashes.
I was going to say probably from eating
like
decayed human flesh.
Yeah.
Pretty shady tincture. So you start to see this stuff drifting with the colonial settlers into the United States. And then you have things, some of the things here we've talked about before, the Native Americans, like the Wendigo and the shapeshifter type shaman guys, things like that, skinwalkers and everything. And it becomes this thing where even more in the modern era, you have people that still kind of believe in this stuff as a real thing and take on that as like a lifestyle choice, based on usually like Vampire the Masquerade and the Lestat books and things. And so you get more variations like psychic vampires and, more glamorous vampires and things in the whole goth scene. But this type of idea of a creature that lives on the essence of life, which is interesting because there's always been an obsession with blood, draining blood, drinking blood, blood sacrifices, cannibalism. They've always had a relationship to culture in either religious terms or as a positive, like in Christianity, Catholicism, where you're actually changing one liquid of wine, actually alchemically or spiritually, you're changing this wine into the blood of Christ, not representational, but an actual transformation. And same thing with the host, actually physically becoming the body of Christ. So you have the positive associations with it as a form of spiritual salvation. And then the negative form of it, which is the taboos like cannibalism and blood drinking and all sorts of, genocide and fratricide and everything else, all the negative aspects. So you see countries like in Eastern Asia where they have things like the hell's the name of that critter? The Aswan.
Oh, the Aswan. Yeah, that thing's creepy.
Yeah, that has like a venom kind of tongue that takes blood through a proboscis, almost as if a mosquito had a tongue instead of a big stinger to suck the blood out. And another really weird one was in the Philippines. There's this thing called the Manananggal, and then there's a female version where the head actually detaches from the torso and pulls all the entrails with it. So the actual monster is this head flying through the air with the entrails behind it, going out seeking blood. And apparently the only way to kill it is you have to find the discarded torso and destroy the torso.
Wow.
Yeah, there's some really wild.
That one's a trip.
Well, I thought it was just amazing that there's so many. I mean, we think vampires, it's almost like, oh, it's Santa Claus. It didn't exist until the 1950s. Well, yeah, it did. I mean, this is something that's, like you said, I mean, look at Vlad, right? Vlad the Impaler. There's so many things throughout history, so many legends of this, whether it be like, vampirism as in, like you said, again, blood. It could be psychic. It can be energy drains, things like that. It seemed like a very real fear to these people is what I'm getting at.
Well, and another one that I found was is pretty interesting to me is that you have all of these Eastern European lore, and then you've got the Asian lore, like you were saying earlier about the importance of the blood and how they were there's this sacrament to it, and then there's also this dark ominousness with it, if that's even a word, ominousness. But
I'll allow it. Yeah.
In the Mayan culture, they even had Xibalba, which was a giant bat that drank blood. It sounds a whole lot like a vampire. That was one of the crazier things that I'd seen, was just drawing the parallels between the Eastern European stuff and this Zabulba predates, the conquistadors coming here. So it's not like something that would have been carried along and said, "Oh, look, they seen the big fruit bats or something of that nature," and they're like, "Oh, that's a vampire."
Of course, depending on where they are in South America, they actually have the only existing bats that live on blood.
Right.
Almost every other species. There may be one other species that lives on blood, but I'm pretty sure it's just a South American vampire. Otherwise, every other bat is eats fruits or pollen or insects. Some hunt fish and frogs too.
Yeah. But like you said, the majority of them are frugivore or insectivore.
Yeah.
And but yeah, South America does have the only actual vampire bat. But it's the actual vampire bat's only like, I think it's got a 6-inch wingspan.
Mm-hmm.
Fairly small bat.
Yeah.
And what's really cool about them is they have this chemical in their saliva that when they'll either find an open wound, which is really common. I've been to South America a lot. You walk around barefoot, or if say your cattle is walking around moving through the jungle, or any kind of livestock you've got, they're going to be dinging their legs and hitting different either thorny bushes or just roots that are gnarled up coming up out of the ground, or rocks for that matter even, and getting these small little cuts. Well, the vampire bat saliva has this chemical in it that kind of acts as like a topical numbing. Yeah. And so that way the host doesn't know that it's being fed upon, which is a really cool evolutionary trait.
Yeah. I would imagine chupacabra has the same thing.
Mm-hmm. Right.
Yeah.
Again, same thing, right, guys? I mean, for real, isn't it? Like,
yeah,
we're talking about a blood sucking something. So.
Yep. Now, what when we were researching, going back and just looking at stuff, one of the things that I came across and really read a whole lot into, and I'm not sure if you guys have looked into it much, was the Romanians, before they had the vampires and before you had your Vlad the Impaler and whatnot, all that, they had this lore of the Strigoi, which is a spirit. They view it as a spirit. Now in modern incarnations, it's kind of like what the vampire is to a degree, but it is the dead come back to life, and it has to feed on human essence, blood, things of that nature. But the Strigoi were very feared and revered by Romanian culture. That was, I guess, their vampire, really, right?
Pretty much, yeah. Yeah, an early variation on it. I mean, a lot of the material that we view today as part of the vampire folklore is really add-ons that, really a lot of it's literature add-ons to the mythology, because Stoker really expanded it quite a bit in Dracula.
Oh, yeah.
And everything jumped off from there, and it's now it's tricky to actually kind of figure out what's folklore and what is, modern folklore. Things like, vampire role-playing games and novels, so many different things, like in a lot of the modern stuff, they talk about like garlic and wooden stakes, and, in older folklore, you could kill a vampire with an iron stake. Almost iron had the power over a vampire, like it had the power over a fairy or any kind of fey creature, whereas things evolved probably because everything was kind of intertangled with like religion and everything, where you start getting elements like silver become part of the folklore and disposing of them, and and even in terms of, I was talking before about how vampire lore gets all mixed up with werewolves. A lot of the werewolf lore was really solidified by the guy who wrote the first Wolfman movie. A lot of that stuff he just created. So a lot of the things that we consider, werewolf go-to information on how you'd kill a werewolf or whatever. That dude was named Kurt Smodiak or something like that. I can't remember. I heard a really good program on was it the Beast of Gavaudan that Monster Talk did years ago, and I think that's where they might have first brought it up. And so you have the same thing with vampires. It's like you'd be hard pressed to pick apart what's actual vampire lore and what was just written in like by Anne Rice or whoever does modern vampire stuff now.
Makes sense,
Now,
man. It's the same thing we see with the cryptids, right? I mean,
yeah,
it's Mothman. You just talked about Mothman. You didn't even know it.
and
Right.
just
Same difference.
just
Yeah.
proof behind like things like creepy pasta is not something new.
It's not
It has
new.
been the bane of everyone's existence for a long time. I haven't been able to nail down the exact source, and Gene, you might know it. It was said that their folklore behind a lot of those what are actually grave vaults were to keep vampires from coming up out of the grave, keep people who are suspected to be vampires. This is all in England. I think there's a few in like France and somewhere else.
Is that where they put like the cage kind of thing over it?
Yes.
Yeah, it's to stop the grave robbers.
I've actually seen those. Yes.
Yeah, the only people who could afford those because they were very expensive because they still buried the person just as deep, but you had this massive iron cage around the entire. It was the earliest rendition of a casket vault.
Mm-hmm.
So it keeps grave robbers out, and this basket of iron essentially crept up over the grave, and people somewhere along the lines turned it in saying that was people who were alleged to be vampires or have some other kind of weird, rising from the dead strangeness going on with them. But I haven't been able to find the source material for that, like where it started. The earliest I can see is stuff from like the 50s and 60s, but I don't know who. I can't find an exact source. I didn't
You
know.
mean
If
who
you might
who
have
who
that one.
weaved that into a new legend? Is that what you're saying?
Yeah,
Yeah.
it was woven into a new legend, and it was
Yeah.
basically like creepy pasta from the 50s and 60s, or
'Cause
maybe
these
even
are
earlier.
ancient. I mean, they're old. First one I seen was in St. Augustine. If that tells you anything. So,
Right.
these they're impressive too. I mean, it's kind of spooky looking. So,
Yeah, those folks, they went into their grave with some of their prized possessions and belongings, and they didn't want them being taken out.
yeah,
So that's why they
which
had
was
this big
common,
vault.
very common back
Yeah.
then.
Well, you also have like the Victorian obsession with death and stuff, where they would
Yeah.
build all these safeguards against burying people alive.
The
Where they have
bell.
Yeah, the bell.
Yeah.
belt that goes all the way
Yeah.
down into the casket because it was, it was fairly common for someone to be exhumed years later for whatever reason, and they'd find scratch marks in there because maybe the person had a stroke and was
Yeah.
temporarily in a coma or something, and they buried him alive.
Or
And
they were just concussed. They slid on a wet floor, hit their head, stuck them in the dirt.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, absolutely. I think it comes down to our ancestors, well, I'll say our ancestors, some people today the same way, but mostly our ancestors, it was they who were trying to rationalize death. They were trying to figure out this great mystery. And to me, it just seems like it permeated a lot of life back then. Like death was part of life because of the plagues and whatnot. And you've seen a lot of these, this lore come out of that, from what I understand.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, there's always been a fascination with death. Again, it's kind of really intertwined with religion,
Mm-hmm.
and everything gets woven into culture with art and everything else. It becomes a facet of life. And and another aspect, which is I've always really been interested in serial killers, and there's a number of them that not only just had bizarre rituals, as most of them kind of do, but some specifically that leaned towards cannibalism and drinking blood and things like that. And there's a couple of them that I found specifically, there was a whole bunch of them between the First and Second War and World Wars in Germany. A couple of them, Fritz Harman and Peter Curtin, both murdered multiple people, did a lot of awful things to them besides. But they would actually bite. I think it was Curtin actually would bite the neck as he strangled them to death and drink their blood. And the other guy, Fritz Harman, or was it Peter? No, Peter Curtin. I think he was the one that actually sold them as meat. And there was a few guys that did that, because everyone was starving. And, guys like that would be the only guy on the block that actually had meat, and no one kind of questioned it. Although people knew to keep their children in the house, if they were outside, they had to be, watched really closely because they'd disappear. And you'd see that in a lot of countries war-torn countries where they had a lot of problems with, people being fed and everything. That happened in Russia, a lot of different places. And
that's the whole basis for the story of Sweeney Todd.
Yeah.
The Broadway play and all that, it's selling human meat during famine.
Yeah, it's really wild. And this stuff that interests me about this subject, I've always really been into vampires, but the modern iteration, like once you kind of get beyond Dracula, it just gets so far into this romantic being that it's not even close to any of the original folklore. A lot of it's tough to watch.
Yeah, it's
there's odds and ends through like the 80s, early 90s. That's pretty good, but for the most part, it's like it's really tough to find a decent vampire book or see a decent vampire movie because it's just garbage.
well, before the flowing black and red capes and velvet, they were pretty much demonic entities and creatures. So that's how it was looked at back in the past. And then someone looked at that, like you said, and said, "Oh, this will make a really good book." So, weave a little bit of truth in there and take some of those legends, and boom, you got what you got. And then of course they got what you really got. I guess it just got destroyed over and over again by some of these movies. So I'm not even going to go there. I'm just going to say, you know what I'm talking about.
But you can track these type of creatures all the way back to like Babylonia and Assyria and stuff like that. And some of them were based. There's can't remember the guy's name. This one, either historian or archaeologist or something, found these Mesopotamian writings that talked about these 7 demons that were somehow sustained by blood, or drink blood, eat bodies, whatever. And they felt that was also a basis for vampirism. And then you find bits and pieces of folklore that's cobbled together with biblical texts where they refer to Lilith, Adam's first wife, as the mother of demons, and that she was potentially like the first vampire and things. But then you're kind of getting into that gray zone where you really getting into literature,
Yeah.
Yeah, when you start bringing in Lilith and things like that, you're getting in, like you said, to a really good gray zone, and it's hard to find any actual text. So it seems to be almost all speculation and conjecture, but it does make for a good story.
Mm-hmm.
No, the whole vampire lore is just a really good story. I mean, I think I was introduced to vampires it was by some little show growing up in the 70s. But I think the one that freaked me out the most, I believe, would have been an episode of Buck Rogers. That was Space Vampire. And if you've never, it was a weird episode. It was basically a vampire in space, from what I remember. But what it was a it was a futuristic version of a Nosferatu.
Mhm.
So that imagery alone, that kind of does it. It's like wow. But it's a very disturbing thing. And then like you said, you have people who run around and they identify as vampires. What can I say? I mean,
Yeah.
it's role playing to the extreme, and you kind of wonder if that's how some of this stuff gets brought to life, so to speak. You know, you almost create it yourself in that way.
Like a
It's
tulip.
yeah, yeah, yeah,
Mhm.
exactly.
Now, you brought up space vampires.
Space vampires.
Gene, what's your take on some of the psychic vampirism?
Well, when you get into psychic stuff or anything that's based heavily in supernatural, I mean, you guys obviously are well versed in the problem with cryptozoology, which is coming up with some sort of data that you can objectively observe and
Right.
uh, and record. And with the supernatural, there's so little, and what's left is so open to interpretation and so subjective in terms of sounds and stuff like that. I mean, so the psychic vampirism, I mean, you could have just, kind of a relationship with two people where just emotionally one person can be draining, you know,
Yeah.
That's right.
you're just drained psychologically and emotionally. And whether there's actual, I think the thing is everyone knows that happens and everyone's experienced it, but I think you'd have be hard pressed to prove that there's actually a transference of energy other than maybe endorphins or something like that.
Mhm.
Maybe if someone like a sociopath would probably get a rush of endorphins and feel, empowered as they're manipulating someone psychologically. And I don't know if you could really record that as an actual transfer of energy being drained from one person to another person.
Yeah,
Where
that would be really
more,
hard.
yeah, it's more of a, I think you'd more record it as a psychological um, effect between two people. So that's my problem with it. I've always been kind of split on things. We kind of had this discussion with the Bigfoot um, conversation we had a while back where there's a lot of things that could be because we literally like about those creatures we really don't know much of anything about them other than
Right.
subjective experiences people have had. I mean, literally the only data that you can record is the footprints because some of them appear to clearly be of some sort of animal, but all the other stuff is anecdotal. Even when you hear a recording of a scream, I mean, I'm not a I'm not an animal. I don't know much of anything about animals, but I know a lot about the type of screams monkeys make, and I've
Sure.
sort of looked into a lot of sounds owls make and a lot of sounds that like coyotes make and stuff because those are the primary culprits on a lot of that stuff.
It
But
it really is. It's one of the fun things though, like from where I've gone through the Master Naturalist program and all that, we have uh trained ears, I guess you could say, when we go out and record stuff. And I've been out with folks and we've been listening for things and we'll hear these anomalous sounds. To everyone else sounds anomalous, but I recognize that as that it's actually a rabbit's distress call, or that's a bobcat that's in heat, or this is actually just a really big coyote and it's probably just woke up and warming its vocal cords up, so it gave a kind of low tone. um, but then it's really nice too because sometimes there's stuff that like I can't ID. So we'll hear it and then we'll mark it like, okay, timestamp. And that way we know go back and listen to the recording and run that through the frequency analyzer and take a look at what kind of range it's in. And we've actually been able to find a couple that were way outside of the range of the animals that we were assuming they were, even with humans. And so that's again, it's still subjective evidence because it's not definitive. Um, we don't have what science would consider an actual Bigfoot call to
Right.
base it off of. We have just other calls that are similar that, kind of have the same frequency patterns.
Yeah, the things that always interest me there is when people come up with things that sound like a variation on a primate. Like howler monkeys make a really interesting, distinctive bark,
Yes.
or like chimp screams. I mean, they don't seem like things. Again, you know, not my specialty. I can kind of dig into this stuff on the internet, but I don't know specifically what could make what noise. But I mean, some things sound more primate-ish, than others, and would lead me to think, well, could be, but
Yeah, but still, you're left with a best guess.
but that at least, all that stuff, even if you're way off the mark and it's some kind of bird or whatever, that's quantifiable evidence. It's not proof of anything in particular, but you can take that sound, even if you didn't get a recording, you can go and compare it to things and sort of build an idea because you have some sort of quantifiable data. When you get into the deep supernatural stuff, like you're talking about, any kind of psychic stuff, I mean, I know they did a lot of work on this in the 60s and the 70s. And in the modern era, you have things like Skinwalker Ranch, where there's supposedly all this stuff going down, but it's like, okay, this has been going on for years and years. Where's the data?
Where's the data? That's my big thing with Skinwalker Ranch too.
Everything that I see, I don't even see like quantifiable data of any kind. You know what I mean?
I think the biggest problem with Skinwalker Ranch is that a lot of it was, majority of it actually was done under Bigelow Aerospace.
Right.
And that's all private. He's never going to release that data until the sun, till end of the world. And God knows if he'd even send it then.
Yeah.
But a lot of the stuff that they're saying they're still having going on, like it's just,
yeah.
Okay, I'll give you that. Some of it's weird, but like,
yeah, it's not. Is it definitive though? It's like
right.
It's like we go back to our old favorite Sasquatch. It's like you hear a lot of things, but are any of them as good as having a body in front of you? It's like, look, I just clipped this thing on the road. It's not,
right.
It's not a dog, and I'm not going near it till somebody else comes. You know what I mean? Something definitive like that, where it's like, well, this thing's gotta be as long as my car and looks kind of like a gorilla or something. I mean, that would be definitive. Who's going to argue with that?
Absolutely.
But with all this other supernatural stuff, and I mean, I'm always torn because I believe in a lot of weird stuff. I mean, I mentioned you guys before. I've kind of dabbled in Wiccanism for about 20 years.
Mm-hmm.
That's sort of I have kind of a religious leaning that's sort of a combination of bits and pieces of Catholicism and Wicca and all sorts of different pagan beliefs that works for me, and I see results from it.
Mm-hmm.
But there's nothing there that I could lay down in front of somebody and say, "See, this is why it makes sense to me. This is why I do it." So I'm hard pressed to kind of, even though I do anyway, I'll hear people tell stories about Bigfoot or whatever and be like, "Really? I don't know." But when you get into all this psychic stuff, and going back to Bigfoot again, like the whole people talk about what is it?
Mind speak.
Yeah, mind speak and getting zapped and all that. It's like, I suspect a lot of people go out there and they prepare themselves to have an experience. And you go out in the middle of the night. When I first got into kind of the spiritual stuff I'm into, I used to go out in the middle of the night into this small canyon that was across the street from our house. And I would set up and do a circle and sit there in the woods just listening and doing my thing. And all you hear is weird crap, squirrels spazzing out and running around. And the smell of the incense would be driving the deer crazy. And they would how they run in little bursts.
Yeah.
Hear all these strange noise and birds and insects and all sorts of crap. I mean, you can really put your head in a psychological space that's very susceptible to suggestion. And even
Absolutely.
by yourself, I would do all this stuff. I mostly did ritual by myself. And you put yourself in that kind of a headspace. And I'm a fairly analytical person, as you guys must have noticed. But when you take a group of people out there and all kind of playing each other into it, getting each
Yeah.
other jazzed and everything, it's like, did you hear that? You can even everybody jokes about it on those ghost shows. It's like, did you hear that? Or like the Bigfoot TV shows. And you could just imagine, being out in the woods, you hear crazy crap, you hear this, that, and the other thing. I mean, I've told you guys before, like where I live, New Jersey's pretty wooded. And the street we live on, we're sort of in the woods. Then there's like a strip of kind of no man's land between us and like a development behind us where I would walk my friend's dog. And back there, you could take a picture of anything back there and say it's a tree structure because
Oh, I'm sure.
bears will root on trees just fall down. There's stuff every which way and standing against each other. And I've heard the weirdest friggin' noises back there. But, I look it up. It's like, okay, that's what a bear sounds like when the baby's up a tree. And that's how she calls the baby back down the tree after she's finished knocking all the garbage cans over on the street. And then I've heard raccoons fighting over nests in the trees and squirrels and everything else running across the roof. Just all sorts of bizarre stuff that you could get yourself psyched up over. And so like I said, when you get into like psychic vampirism and stuff, I think it's valid in that the person who wants to be victimized or who is victimized is they tend towards being that type of a sub type person. And
Sure.
the dominant person that feels that they're able to draw energy, it's the exact reverse. It depends on their personal psychology, their mental state and all of that, but there again, I believe in a lot of weird stuff myself, so I can't discount it for sure. It's always been that way for me, and I'm kind of on the cusp. That's why when I look at both communities where you have believers and skeptics of, pick your poison of any community, both of them are like, they're like religious zealot groups because neither one of them, you'll get some people that are probably like, you guys are pretty much along the same lines as I am with this stuff. And, but you look at those groups and it's like, neither one of them is willing to cede any ground to the other side in it, or they'll just say, well, actually, I'm pretty skeptical. And they're not skeptical at all. They believe absolutely everything. But their point of being skeptical is that they won't say yay to like every like blob squatch in a photograph, or like things like, okay, here we go with the Jacobs photos again. These Sasquatches or these bears, and you get the old chestnuts that pop up all the time. But I mean, what the hell? As long as it doesn't hurt anybody, who cares? But
Right.
I don't think there's very much of it that's valuable as data. It's all anecdotal stuff. In modern folklore, it's building a modern folklore. Like Bigfoot, that folklore is built way beyond anything that the native population came up with. Just since like the 50s or so. Think of all the stuff that's been built up around that creature that, there's really almost nothing to support it,
Yeah, and you're not wrong at all.
Mm-hmm.
It's there has been, like you had said, since the 50s, it has evolved in such a way that it it no longer resembles the folklore that you were being told from the past, which I'm more keen to a lot of the older stories and hearing these older tales from the First Nations folks and hearing these tales from the old folklore from the pioneers moving in, and looking at similarities between their reports and what people are seeing today, rather than a lot of the theories and stuff that get tossed out there as gospel that people will run with today. I'm more interested in the similarities between what people are experiencing today versus what they were experiencing, 150, 200, 300 years ago.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think the vampire is sort of like the modern equivalent to that. It's actually it's existed probably longer than that. I mean, you could maybe chase Bigfoot back to like the wood wolves and stuff like that, but it's kind of a stretch. It's an interesting kind of anecdote to go back to stretch Bigfoot back even further. But I mean, the vampire thing you can chase way far back to blood drinking creatures. But in terms of an actual real world correlation, I don't know, man. There's part of me that would love that to be a real thing.
And you're not like, I'm in the same boat with you on that too. I mean, it's part of me, the part that wants to fantasize about the crazy and the fantastic being right there. It's be really cool if it was such a thing, but I don't think your goth or emo neighbor that sips on, really, 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 really red stained Kool-Aid is really gonna be getting any kind of vampirism going on.
Yeah, and like I said, I mean, people are into it. I am to a degree too, as far as the folkloric aspect of it, as long as it doesn't hurt anybody. But when you get down to brass tacks and you want to try to establish things as an actual reality, then really what you get into is a spiritual belief. You get into a religion.
Yeah, it's a religion.
Cult.
Yeah, I mean, it's just like we've talked about with cryptozoology. It becomes the same thing. You have sets of religious belief, and they're elements of faith. Like you have Dr. Meldrum always talks about, when people ask him if he believes in Bigfoot, and he makes a point to explain that, belief is an element of faith, as opposed to knowing something exists or hypothesizing something exists based on some sort of recordable evidence, like, I mean, you think about vampires and werewolves and things like that. Even like the modern equivalent of the werewolf would be the dogman. I mean, it's like, look, there's absolutely nothing that we've found in the fossil record that represents something like a werewolf, unless you just want to say a wolf, a big wolf. Yeah. Then that's kind of the quitter's way to sort of find a correlation. But there's nothing that relates to something like a werewolf. And in reality, when you look at what happened with with wolves in Europe and even in the United States, how they're basically driven to extinction because wolf attacks became so problematic. You flip that around, if you had an animal that was as smart as a human and as feral as a wolf, we would be the population in decline. You think, like, with so many, how did our population explode with any population of werewolves? And, a handful of people disappearing in parks does not represent,
no,
what that type of animal would do, because you just think about, like, obviously wolves pretty much got almost wiped out and they're returning in areas. They're kind of bringing them back. But you think about grizzly bears and super predators like that. I mean, high populations of those things everywhere, like people see these dogmen allegedly, I just don't buy it. You know what I mean?
See, I think when it comes to the dogman, and it could be even with some of the issues in the past with vampires and stuff too, it could very well be some form of like a tulpa. Mm-hmm. Where it is this psychic projection. But again, you get back into that, it's very hard to prove because you're looking at supernatural ties and whatnot. Right. And And speaking of the dog man and Rougarou, whatever, this is side railing away from the story, but have you noticed the uptick on Instagram with your dog man sculpt or Rougarou sculpt being thrown in on stuff recently, man?
Yeah, I know a few guys that are toy photographers.
Yeah.
And because they started shooting that with like, they were kind of mixing it in with different figures, but a lot of times the Horseman's, what is that? Mystic Realms or
Yes.
Seventh King. I can't remember what their current one is. It's like the medieval Lord of the Rings kind of thing.
Yep.
But mixing them in, fighting those guys and everything. And I think a lot of other toy photographer guys, I see, they always tag me in the posts. And I see all these other photographers, oh, where'd you get that werewolf from, And they start seeing it in more and more posts because they want to use it for that. Because someone was asking me not too long ago, they're like, because I was crapping on some werewolf figure I saw online that people were talking about. And I was like, yeah, I don't have the fur's really sloppy. And, because I try not to be a douche about stuff like that. But sometimes I see stuff and it's like, well, it just annoys me because it's like, why did they go the extra step? That could be much cleaner. It could be nicer.
Yeah.
And so this one dude that I talk to from time to time is like, well, so what do you like? And you can't name your own figure. And it's like, and I started thinking about it because I pick up a lot of this stuff. And it's like, I don't know if I'd be able to pick something that I was like, well, this is what I would say is my favorite werewolf. You know what I mean? Because all of them have something that I like, or I wouldn't have bought the figure. But if I go through them, it's like, the anatomy's not great, or the fur's a little sloppy, or the head looks dorky, But, what? It just comes down to, personal aesthetic. But,
right. Yeah, I thought that was pretty fun. Just over the last few months, I've seen that action figure pop up in dozens of photos, and I'm like, oh, this is great. There's like this mini resurgence there with creature replica stuff.
It's funny, like you would think that with the amount of sites that I got to cover those when they first came out, that like most people that were into the action figure thing would be aware, but it's not necessarily the case because there's just so much stuff out there, but it's like a resurgence, especially for that figure, that a lot of people are finding it because some of these other guys are using it as a, one of their props in a diorama, with other figures and stuff like that, which is cool. I mean, we're basically going to be, what we're doing is going to basically be a reboot. It's been so long since the first series,
Sure.
But, yeah, I mean, so the Dogman thing too, modern werewolves, man, I'd love, when I was a kid, I wanted to be one. But
yeah, right. Like, right now, not when I'm a kid, I'm freaking 36 years old. Like werewolf. Yes, that would be awesome. Right now. Let's do it.
I know. But, yeah, I haven't seen anything because with Dogman, you don't even have believable footprints,
No.
At least Sasquatch, you got some footprints that are, pretty convincing. I mean, I can kind of follow what Meldrum talks about, obviously, and I have a ton of respect for that dude. But I don't have his anatomical knowledge to appreciate what's going on. What he calls the kinematics of the foot movement in the, and most of the footprints that get released that you see, they kind of look just like that stomped footprint. It's like, okay, there's no movement in that foot. Why would I believe that, And then our best piece of data, which is still contested, is the patty film. I mean, over the years, I've always kind of suspected it was real, but over the years, it's just kind of become more real for me, There's just too much that I see in there. As somebody that studies and works with anatomy every single day, and I spent like 13 years of my life as a butcher, so I can disassemble an animal too and know what I'm looking at.
Yeah.
I just, there's too much in there that I see moving in that body and stuff. And maybe I'm an idiot and it's totally fake, but I just don't think so, because again, like I hear stuff on one side where it's like people in the Bigfoot community talk about things they're seeing in that
Oh,
film.
gosh.
Not even the crazy stuff like the Bigfoot shootings and everything. Just
Sure.
Oh,
they
gosh.
see the movement of the body, and it's like, nah, that's not even there. You know, and I'm
Yeah.
really looking at it. And then I see stuff that people from the skeptical community comment on, and they're totally missing tons of stuff. Like when I did my statue, I actually contacted Dr. Meldrum, and he sent me stills that he had, really high quality stills. And of course, you know, the picture's like this big, and then Patty's like that big in the still, and I'm blowing it up, blowing it up, blowing it up. But the thing I was able to find in there that was interesting, aside from certain muscle groups in the back that are clearly in motion, I was actually able to see how the hair was moving on the forearms. You know, they always talk about how hair on the Sasquatch is a little longer. They say 5-6 inches, blah, blah, blah. But, you know, I saw areas where the hair was moving in different directions based on, you know, I'm looking at pixelation, of course. So
Sure.
probably 80% of it is my imagination filling in the gaps, but I'm fairly good at analyzing things like that because, like, there again, that's what I work with all the time. And a lot of things like that, I was like, man, that's awfully convincing. But then at the same time, there's things like when the foot is completely vertical to the camera, it just looks like a slipper. It looks totally fake. You know what I mean?
Yeah, it looks weird.
But
But then when you think about what the bottom of a foot would have to look like to live in such a rugged condition,
yeah,
you know, you look at the bottom of like a rhinoceros or an elephant or anything of that nature, you know, it's got that kind of weight on it, or even bears for that matter. You got that big fat pad.
right.
So,
Very
but at the same time, it still does look like a big old massive slipper.
yeah. But then again, it's like you get down to the way it's walking. It's like, try to walk where you actually lift your back leg that's coming off the ground so that your foot's perpendicular to the ground. I mean, it's been proven that a person can walk like that. It just takes a while to get it down. But to actually do that, the amount of energy that you would expend trying to walk like that
Yeah.
just doesn't, there's so many things in that film do not make sense as, you know, a hoax, you know, but
My
yeah,
biggest thing, just since we're on that topic, my biggest thing with that film is because I'm kind of like an anatomy nerd too, from being, you know, sculpting, but also I went through nursing school and I almost graduated before I dropped out and went to culinary school. You can see that right leg when it strikes the ground. You can see the impact ripple go through that muscle, and that's just like
to when I was at Monster Palooza a couple of years before the plague hit, I was talking to, I won't mention his name, but I was talking to this pretty famous special effects dude who came up to my table and we started talking about the pet. And he was saying, like, you know, that was the FBI cutting in because I was getting into
yeah,
want
the
to
fuzz is on us.
so anyway, so this guy started talking about how a creature that big, you'd see the shock of the feet hitting the ground, going through the body, see the muscles shimming and stuff. And I was thinking about it, I was like, yeah, he's kind of right. But then with the last time there was that the 4K enhancement, and
Yeah.
they did that, and where it was stabilized, you saw the enhancement. You actually saw that shockwave going through the leg muscles, like like you were just starting
Yeah.
to say. So, you know, to me, that was another, you know, another piece of it that was kind of, you know, convincing. I mean, there are spots where I've heard people argue that the lower leg looks more like a pants leg, which in spots you do get a little of that impression, but I get more of an impression of a big developed calf muscle, you know? So it all comes back to Bigfoot, really. But I mean, or at least for idiots like us, you know,
right.
but that's the thing. I mean, as much as that film's been contested, you know, there's still an argument over it. You know, everybody thinks they're right on it, whether it's real or not real or whatever. But pull a piece of data like that whether, again, whether it's real or not real, that correlates to a dog man or correlates to a vampire. And I mean, there was that really badass dogman video that turned out to be a really nice piece of special effects fakery. I can't remember what they called it, but it came walking out of the weeds. Man, when I first saw that movie, just all the hair on the back of my neck went up. I was like, this is, I suspected
it was really well done.
Oh my God. Yeah, that was freaky. But, but where is there a piece of any kind of footage like that? I mean, you could, with Sasquatch, you could make a case for the Freeman footage, which looks super cool. It's just the dude's reputation wasn't great. He had rep for seasoning.
His reputation kind of, he had that limelight disease is what I call it. When you fall out of the spotlight for too long, you've got to do something to get yourself back in. But at the same time, like, and I mean this in the nicest way possible, everything that I've read about him, every interview I've read from him or watched that he was a part of, or listened to rather, didn't really watch any because just audio that you can really listen to. I honestly don't think the dude was smart enough to pull it off. Like, and I don't mean that in a bad way. Like I just don't think he had the faculties to be able to pull that kind of a hoax off. Now, somebody could have hoaxed him. That could have been a thing.
Yeah. You're probably right about that. I mean, I kind of feel the same way about the Patty film too. It's like, people talk about how talented Roger Patterson was, and I always hear the thing about building the little stagecoaches, and it's like, you guys understand because you work with these type of materials.
Right.
It's like, unless you have like some kind of at least half-assed lab set up in your house, you can't work with this stuff. It's very sensitive to like moisture. And imagine we're using all the best stuff that's been made up to this point. It's inexpensive. It works great. I use a lot of the smooth on stuff, and you can screw up all over the place, and it's pretty forgiving.
Yeah.
Whereas you're talking about a couple of guys doing it in a garage with the stuff that existed in the late 50s and 60s.
The most primitive rendition of what we use today.
Yeah, I don't see it, maybe we're all totally wrong, but based on the things that I have real world experience with, like and you guys do too with anatomy and these type of materials and stuff, I don't really see it, and all the arguments against it tend to be wildly misinformed or just, myopic in their view. They already got something in their head. But I'd love to see that type of level of of data. I guess evidence. It's also evidence. It's not proof. It's evidence. But I'd love to see that level of evidence for something supernatural like a vampire. And there's just nothing. I mean, you think about the most famous case I can think of is the Highgate vampire, where there was that priest dude in like the late 60s, early 70s. I think there was an In Search of show on it where there was this guy who was following this case where people would see what they thought was a vampire coming and going in this Highgate cemetery in London or thereabouts in London. And as a kid, I was just like, oh my God, they're going to get a film of this, but therein lies the problem. That's the difference between where you're hunting some sort of anomalous animal or you're hunting some sort of supernatural being, supernatural being. I mean, that's like, like if you take it to cryptozoology, any of those creatures that tread into the supernatural realm, there's a good chance you'll never get any kind of proof. If they can do that, if they can, I talked to some friends of mine that are Native American and they talk about this folklore. They look at Bigfoot as a creature that has a foot in each realm. If that's the case, if this is that type of creature, how do you ever get evidence? They literally.
How do you nail something like that down?
Yeah. Whereas, I mean, I think for most people, you kind of pick the you sort of pick the hill you're gonna die on. You know what I mean? It's like, all right, it's a creature. I'm not looking, I'm not looking at this other stuff, because you get into areas where it's like you can't quantify any of it. You know what it does is it blurs it so that you can't quantify it as wrong because there's no way to disprove it. You know, but that's not, I don't know, an unquantifiable data set. Is that a valuable data set? I guess it's still data,
It's still data. Yeah.
It's
Ron,
just,
you there with us still?
Here, but it's still kind of doing some weird stuff.
Okay. Well, I think we're at a good point where we can go ahead and I believe wrap her down or up, however you want to do it.
Wrap her down.
I don't know.
Is next week mummies? What are we doing?
Yeah.
I don't understand.
Hey, sure. That sounds like a good one. Let's do mummies next week.
Mummies.
I like
it. All right. So my audio is back, and I suggest mummies, and all right, then it works.
There we go. Topic for next week is set. I like it. So guys, if you've enjoyed listening to this episode, you can go listen to even more of our content over at wildandweirdwv.com. Hit the podcast link and you're going to be able to go through our entire backlog. Don't forget, we are also uploading older shows onto YouTube, as well as all of our new shows will premiere early on YouTube first, and then you can listen to them the following Monday in podcast format. We've got Wild and Weird Con coming up, so you definitely don't want to forget about that. That is November the 6th. You will not want to miss the events that are taking place at Chief Logan State Park at the Conference Center and Lodge there. It's going to be amazing. Workshops, vendors galore. It's going to have it all, guys. We have workshops that we're going to be nailing the dates down for soon for 2022. You will definitely want to make it out to those, so stay tuned and listen into those. Do not forget that Paint the Town Weird is going on. So if you're listening to this episode and you are planning on coming to Wild and Weird Con and you live in the area, get involved. Start promoting it around in the grocery stores. Like, just print off a flyer, slap it on the wall.
Go over to the website. There's a flyer there.
Yeah, the file's there on the website for you to go grab. We're going to start putting a link to that out for you guys, and we're just going to spread this around like crazy and get everybody to come out that we can. It's going to be a blast. Let's see. If you want to keep supporting Wild and Weird Radio and keep it free for eons to come, swing on over to wildandweirdwv.com. Click on the shop tab. It's going to open everything up for you there. You'll be able to go into any of our various portals that will open up our shops. Last and not least, if you have had an encounter yourself, if you would like to come on the show, or maybe you've had some kind of a strange sighting, feel free to contact us at wildandweirdwv@gmail.com, or go to wildandweirdwv.com and hit the Contact Us tab, and you can actually fill out our standardized sighting report right there. And you never know, if you are in our area, we will actually get out and investigate. If you're outside of our area, we have contacts all over the nation, and we can get that report into the hands of somebody who can actually get boots on the ground, as long as the sighting or encounter is fresh enough. So, without any further ado, Gene, thanks for being with us. It's been a blast. It's always fun having you on the show, and can't wait to have you back again, man.
For sure.
Well, guys, stay wild and weird, everybody.
All right, thanks, guys. Good night.